The autumn of 1889 arrived cold and early in Ashford Hollow, a settlement of fewer than 200 souls nestled in the wooded hills of western Pennsylvania. Elizabeth Garrett had lived there all her 23 years, teaching reading and arithmetic to the children of farmers and mill workers in the small schoolhouse her father had built before his death. Her life followed a pattern as regular as the seasons: morning lessons, afternoon visits to elderly parishioners, evening readings by lamplight in the narrow cottage she shared with her widowed mother. The town itself seemed perpetually caught between progress and decay. The lumber mill that had once promised prosperity now operated only intermittently, its machinery agging and its workforce dwindling. Most young men had left for Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, seeking wages that Ashford Hollow could no longer provide. Those who remained carried an air of quiet resignation, their conversations limited to weather, crops, and the slow diminishment of everything familiar. It was into this atmosphere of fading hope that Nathaniel Ashford returned in late September. The grandson of the town's founder, he had been absent for nearly 15 years, pursuing what rumor suggested were medical studies in Boston and abroad. His arrival was marked by neither celebration nor ceremony, simply the appearance of a tall, thin figure in a dark coat stepping from the afternoon coach, accompanied by 3 heavy trunks and an unsettling silence. Elizabeth first saw him at Sunday service, seated in the Ashford family pew that had stood empty for more than a decade. He was perhaps 40 years old, with sharp features and eyes that seemed perpetually focused on something just beyond whoever he addressed. When Reverend Holmes welcomed him back to the congregation, Nathaniel responded with a brief nod but no words, his pale hands folded precisely in his lap. After the service, he approached Elizabeth with a directness that felt improper for a first meeting. "Miss Garrett," he said, though they had never been introduced, "I understand you teach the children here. I should like to discuss educational matters with you tomorrow afternoon, if you would be so kind as to visit Ashford House." Before Elizabeth could respond with anything beyond a surprised murmur, he had turned away, leaving her standing in the churchyard with her mother gripping her arm tightly. "That family," her mother whispered. "There was always something not quite right about them. His grandfather was a hard man, and his father worse. Be careful, Elizabeth." The next afternoon, Elizabeth walked the mile to Ashford House, a large stone structure on the hill overlooking the town. The building had deteriorated during its years of abandonment, but fresh repairs were already visible: new shutters on the windows, cleared pathways, a repainted door. When she knocked, Nathaniel himself answered, gesturing her inside without warmth or welcome. The interior smelled of chemicals and old wood. Crates stood unopened in the hallway, and through a doorway Elizabeth glimpsed what appeared to be medical equipment arranged on tables with unsettling precision. Nathaniel led her to a study lined with books, their titles mostly in Latin and German, many concerning anatomy and diseases of the mind. "I have returned to establish a practice here," Nathaniel explained, his voice measured and oddly flat. "The people of Ashford Hollow have been without proper medical care for too long. I intend to remedy that situation. However, I have also noticed a concerning lack of scientific education among the youth. I propose to supplement your teaching with lectures on natural philosophy and hygiene." Elizabeth felt instinctively that she should refuse, but the words that emerged were cautious and polite. "That is generous, Mr. Ashford, but I would need to consult with the town council about changes to the curriculum." His smile was thin and mirthless. "Of course, I have already spoken with them. They were quite agreeable to my involvement. I believe you will find, Miss Garrett, that Ashford Hollow remembers who built it and to whom it properly belongs." Within 2 weeks, Nathaniel Ashford had inserted himself into nearly every aspect of life in Ashford Hollow. He offered free medical consultations to families who could not afford a doctor's fees, appearing at farmhouses with his black bag and leaving behind bottles of tonic with handwritten instructions. He donated books to the church library and money to repair the mill's largest saw. He attended town council meetings, speaking little but observing everything with those unnervingly focused eyes. Elizabeth found herself unable to prevent his intrusion into her schoolhouse. He arrived each Thursday afternoon to deliver what he called scientific instruction, speaking to the children about the human body in terms that felt both too detailed and strangely abstract. He brought diagrams of skeletal structures and preserved specimens in jars, insisting the children observe them closely despite their obvious discomfort. "Knowledge dispels superstition," he told Elizabeth when she gently suggested his materials might be too advanced. "These children have been raised in ignorance and fear. I am providing them with truth." But the truth he offered felt wrong in ways Elizabeth struggled to articulate. He spoke of pain as instructive, of suffering as necessary for proper development of character. He described diseases with an enthusiasm that bordered on admiration, lingering over details of symptoms and deterioration. When young Timothy Fletcher fainted during a particularly graphic description of surgical procedures, Nathaniel showed no concern, merely observing the boy's unconscious form with clinical interest before continuing his lecture. Elizabeth began keeping the children after his visits, offering them simple stories and gentle reassurance, trying to counteract whatever unease his presence created. But she noticed changes in them, a new hesitancy in their play, a tendency to watch one another with suspicious eyes, a disturbing repetition of Nathaniel's phrases about weakness and strength. Her mother's health began to decline that October, a persistent cough that worsened despite all remedies. When Nathaniel heard of her illness, he appeared at their cottage uninvited, insisting on examining the patient. Elizabeth's protests were overridden by her mother's desperate hope for relief. He spent nearly an hour in the bedroom, emerging with a bottle of dark liquid and instructions for its administration twice daily. "Your mother suffers from a weakness of the lungs," he pronounced. "This tonic will provide temporary relief, but her constitution has been compromised. She will require ongoing treatment, which I am prepared to provide without charge, naturally." The tonic did seem to help at first, easing her mother's coughing and allowing her to sleep more peacefully. But Elizabeth noticed her mother becoming increasingly dependent on Nathaniel's visits, asking for him when she felt distressed, following his instructions with an obedience that seemed excessive. When Elizabeth suggested consulting another doctor from a neighboring town, her mother became agitated, insisting that Nathaniel understood her condition in ways no other physician could. It was Martha Hayes, the elderly widow who lived at the edge of town, who first spoke her concerns aloud. She appeared at Elizabeth's door one evening after dark, her face tight with fear. "There is something you should know about that man," Martha whispered, glancing over her shoulder though the street was empty. "His grandfather kept detailed journals. My late husband worked for him and saw things that troubled him deeply. The Ashford family has always had interests that extended beyond proper medicine." Before Martha could say more, a figure appeared on the road, a dark shape moving with purposeful stride. Martha gasped and hurried away, leaving Elizabeth standing in her doorway, watching Nathaniel Ashford approach through the autumn darkness. "Good evening, Miss Garrett," he said, stopping at her gate. "I was passing and thought to check on your mother's progress. Has she been taking the tonic as directed?" "Yes," Elizabeth managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "She seems improved." "Excellent. Consistency is essential in these treatments. I trust you will ensure she does not neglect her doses. Interruption of the regimen could prove quite serious for someone in her delicate condition." He tipped his hat and continued down the road, but Elizabeth remained frozen in her doorway, understanding with cold certainty that what had sounded like medical advice had been something else entirely. A warning, a reminder of her mother's dependence, and by extension, her own vulnerability. November brought early snow to Ashford Hollow, isolating the settlement behind drifts that made travel difficult and communication with neighboring towns nearly impossible. The isolation seemed to amplify Nathaniel Ashford's presence, as though the closed roads and shortened days had trapped everyone more firmly in his orbit. Elizabeth noticed a change in how people spoke of him, or rather, how carefully they avoided speaking of him at all. When she attempted to discuss her concerns with Reverend Holmes, the elderly minister shifted uncomfortably and suggested she might be allowing feminine nervousness to cloud her judgment. When she mentioned Martha Hayes's cryptic warning to Mrs. Patterson at the general store, the woman's expression closed like a door, and she quickly found urgent business in the back room. The children's behavior grew stranger. Little Sarah Morton began drawing elaborate diagrams during lessons, copying symbols she said Mr. Ashford had shown them. When Elizabeth examined the papers, she found anatomical sketches far too sophisticated for a 9-year-old hand, accompanied by notes in a script that was not Sarah's childish printing, but something older and more deliberate. When questioned, Sarah could not explain how she had produced them. Elizabeth's mother continued her decline despite, or perhaps because of Nathaniel's treatments. The tonic that had initially helped now seemed essential. Missing even a single dose left her mother trembling and gasping for air in a way that seemed less like illness and more like withdrawal. Elizabeth tried diluting the medicine, hoping to reduce her mother's dependence, but Nathaniel appeared the very next day, somehow aware of the modification. "You are not medically trained, Miss Garrett," he said quietly, standing in their small parlor with an expression of mild disappointment. "Tampering with prescribed treatments can have consequences you are not equipped to understand. Your mother's condition requires precisely calibrated doses. I must ask you to administer the tonic exactly as directed, or I fear I cannot be responsible for her deterioration." "What is in that medicine?" Elizabeth demanded, finding courage in desperation. His smile was cold and patient, a combination of compounds developed through extensive research. "The formula is proprietary, naturally. I do not expect you to comprehend the scientific principles involved. I simply expect you to follow instructions for your mother's benefit." After he left, Elizabeth examined the bottle more closely. The liquid was thick and dark, with a faint chemical odor underlying something sweeter and more organic. She considered taking it to an apothecary in another town, but the roads remained blocked, and her mother's anxiety at the mere suggestion of abandoning the treatment made such investigation impossible. It was during a particularly harsh snowstorm that Elizabeth discovered Nathaniel's true hold on the town. Unable to reach the schoolhouse due to drifts, she instead helped organize a community gathering at the church to distribute blankets and supplies to families in need. As she moved through the crowd, she heard fragments of conversations that gradually assembled into a pattern of fear. Nathaniel had provided loans to farmers facing failure, medicines to families with sick children, employment to men desperate for work at the slowly reopening mill, which he had purchased quietly through an intermediary. Each act of apparent generosity carried invisible strings, obligations, dependencies, debts both financial and social. Those who had initially welcomed his return now found themselves trapped in webs of gratitude and obligation from which withdrawal seemed impossible. "He forgave half my debt when my son took that fever," one farmer admitted to another in a low voice, not knowing Elizabeth stood nearby. "But now when he asks favors, how can I refuse? He saved the boy's life, or so he claims. What kind of man would I be to deny him?" That evening, Martha Hayes appeared at Elizabeth's cottage again, this time bringing a leather satchel wrapped in oilcloth. "These belong to my husband," she whispered urgently. "Notes he kept about the old Ashford family. He wanted them destroyed, but I could not bring myself to do it. Now I think you should have them. Read them carefully, Miss Garrett, and then decide what must be done." Inside the satchel were journals spanning decades, written in a cramped, frightened hand. They described the elder Ashford's experiments with what they called purification through suffering, their belief that pain could elevate human consciousness to higher states, their systematic documentation of how much torment the human body could endure while maintaining life. The entries spoke of secret rooms in Ashford House, of subjects brought in darkness, of a family obsession spanning generations. The final entry, dated 15 years prior, read, "Young Nathaniel has gone away to study medicine in Boston. Perhaps the distance and proper scientific training will cure him of the family madness, but I fear he carries it in his blood as surely as his grandfather did. If he returns, God help Ashford Hollow." December brought a crisis that exposed the full extent of Nathaniel's control. Timothy Fletcher, the boy who had fainted during one of Nathaniel's lectures, developed a mysterious illness that left him bedridden and delirious. His parents, both dependent on Nathaniel for employment at the mill, sent for him immediately. He arrived with his medical bag and spent several hours examining the child behind closed doors. When he emerged, his expression was grave. "The boy suffers from a severe nervous disorder," he announced to the gathering neighbors. "Without proper treatment, I fear permanent damage to his mental faculties. However, I have developed a therapeutic regimen that may prove effective. It will require him to remain under close observation at Ashford House, where I have appropriate facilities. Elizabeth, present because she had been teaching Timothy his letters just days before, felt ice form in her chest. Surely he would be better with his family, she said carefully. Nathaniel's eyes fixed on her with predatory focus. Miss Garrett, you presume medical knowledge you do not possess. This child's condition is delicate and complex. Only specialized care can save him from a fate worse than death, a life of mindless incapacity. The Fletchers, terrified and powerless, agreed to the arrangement. Timothy was carried to Ashford House that evening, pale and unconscious, while his mother wept silently and his father stared at the ground with the defeated expression of a man who knows he has sacrificed his son but sees no alternative. Elizabeth could not sleep that night. The journals Martha had given her described similar cases, children and adults taken to Ashford House for treatment, supposedly for their own benefit, disappearing into the building for days or weeks. Some returned changed, speaking little and moving as though their minds had been carefully edited. Others never returned at all, their deaths explained as tragic outcomes of illnesses too severe for even the most skilled intervention. The next morning, Elizabeth made a decision that terrified her but seemed unavoidable. She went to see Reverend Holmes, bringing with her the most damning pages from Martha's husband's journals. The elderly minister read them slowly, his hands trembling, his face growing pale. "This is a serious accusation," he said finally. "If these claims are true, then Nathaniel Ashford is a monster. But if they are false, or exaggerated, or misunderstood, then we accuse an innocent man and risk everything he provides for this community." "He has a child now," Elizabeth said quietly. "Timothy Fletcher. Whatever he intends to do, he is doing it right now in that house to a boy who trusted us to protect him." Reverend Holmes was silent for a long moment, staring at his own hands folded on the desk. Finally, he looked up with something close to despair in his eyes. "What would you have me do, Miss Garrett? Nathaniel controls the mill that employs half the town. He holds debts and obligations. He provides medicines people have become dependent upon, like your own mother. If we move against him and fail, the consequences will be severe. And if we succeed, we may destroy ourselves in the process." Elizabeth left the church understanding that she was alone. The authority figures who should have protected the community were paralyzed by fear and complicity. If Timothy Fletcher was to be saved, if the truth about Nathaniel Ashford was to be exposed, it would require something the town had lost, someone willing to act despite the cost. That night she told her mother she was going to visit a friend and instead made her way through fresh snow to Ashford House. The building loomed dark against the winter sky, most windows unlit except for a dim glow from the eastern wing. Elizabeth circled the property, searching for a way inside, her heart hammering with fear that felt almost paralyzing. She found an unlocked door at the rear of the house, leading into what had once been a servant's entrance. The corridor beyond was narrow and cold, smelling of chemicals and something organic she could not identify. She moved forward carefully, following the faint light toward what she hoped was Timothy's location. Instead, she found something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A room lined with journals similar to those Martha had given her, shelf after shelf of notebooks filled with observations, diagrams, measurements. And in the center of the room, on a table, fresh entries in Nathaniel's precise handwriting describing ongoing experiments in pain tolerance, mental malleability, and what he called the physiology of suffering. A sound behind her made Elizabeth turn in terror. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his expression neither angry nor surprised, merely interested. "Garrett," he said softly, "how determined you are, how wonderfully predictable. Do you know what separates human beings from animals? Not intelligence or language, but something far more profound, our capacity to understand and transcend our own suffering. I have devoted my life to exploring that capacity, and now you have volunteered to help me continue my research." Elizabeth ran. She had no conscious plan, only the animal instinct to escape the cold certainty in Nathaniel's voice. She fled down the corridor away from him, deeper into Ashford House, desperately seeking another exit. Behind her, his footsteps followed at an unhurried pace, confident and methodical. She burst through a door into what appeared to be a laboratory. Glass instruments lined tables, bottles containing substances of various colors stood in precise rows, and against one wall were cages of different sizes, most empty, but some containing rabbits and rats that stirred at her intrusion. At the far end of the room, another door stood partially open. Elizabeth pushed through it and found stairs descending into darkness. She had no choice but to go down, feeling her way along a stone wall that grew increasingly cold and damp. At the bottom, her groping hands found a lantern hanging from a hook. With trembling fingers, she struck a match from a tin she found beside it and lit the wick. The light revealed a corridor carved from bedrock, extending beyond the house's foundation into the hill itself. Along both walls were doors with small barred windows. Elizabeth moved forward, compelled by a horrible certainty about what she would find. The first 3 cells were empty, but furnished with narrow beds, chains attached to walls, and stains on the floors that were unmistakably blood. The 4th contained Timothy Fletcher, lying unconscious on a bed, his breathing shallow but steady. Marks on his arms suggested recent injections, and beside the bed was a notebook filled with observations in Nathaniel's handwriting. Elizabeth was working to open the locked door when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She had minutes at most. Frantically, she searched Timothy's cell through the bars, hoping to find keys or something useful. Instead, her eyes fell on the notebook, and she grabbed it through the bars, tucking it inside her coat. The 5th cell contained something far worse. The emaciated form of a man she vaguely recognized as Jacob Walsh, a drifter who had arrived in Ashford Hollow the previous spring and disappeared shortly after. He was alive but barely conscious, his body marked with what appeared to be systematic wounds in various stages of healing. "Research subjects," Nathaniel's voice said calmly from behind her. Elizabeth whirled to find him standing at the base of the stairs, holding a lantern of his own. "Mr. Walsh arrived with no family, no connections, no one to miss him. He has contributed significantly to my understanding of sustained trauma response. And young Timothy, whose parents have so thoughtfully placed him in my care, promises equally valuable data." "You are insane," Elizabeth breathed. "On the contrary, I am perfectly sane and quite methodical. My grandfather began this work, my father continued it, and now I have refined it beyond their limited understanding. Each generation of Ashfords has added to our knowledge of human endurance, pain response, and the limits of consciousness. We are answering questions that medical science lacks the courage to ask." Elizabeth forced herself to remain calm, to think despite her terror. "The town will come looking for me." "Will they? You left your home at night without explanation. Your mother, dependent on my treatments, will assume you have been irresponsible and thoughtless. By the time anyone thinks to search, you will have become another unfortunate victim of the harsh winter. Perhaps you fell into a drift and froze. Tragedies happen in isolated communities." But Elizabeth had noticed something during his speech. The keys hanging from his belt, and the distance between them, and the narrow corridor offering no room to maneuver. She had also noticed that Nathaniel, confident in his control, had brought no weapon beyond his certainty of his own superiority. She threw her lantern directly at his face. Oil and flame exploded against the wall as he jerked aside, creating a barrier of fire between them. Elizabeth ran past him up the stairs while he beat at flames catching on his coat. She heard him curse, the first emotion she had heard from him, and his footsteps pounding after her. She reached the main floor and ran toward the front door, but it was locked from the inside with a mechanism she could not work in her panic. She veered instead toward the study where she had first met Nathaniel, hopping for a window low enough to escape through. The room's window was locked, but a heavy bookend provided means to shatter the glass. Elizabeth wrapped her coat around her arm and struck hard, breaking through into the freezing night. She was halfway through when Nathaniel's hands seized her ankle. "You are making this unnecessarily difficult," he said, his calm voice returning despite the burn marks on his face. "Submit to necessity, Miss Garrett. Your fate is already determined." Elizabeth kicked hard with her free foot, connecting with his injured face. His grip loosened just enough for her to wrench free, tumbling into the snow outside. She ran, stumbling through drifts toward town, clutching the stolen notebook inside her coat like a talisman against the darkness pursuing her. She did not look back until she reached the first houses of Ashford Hollow. Only then did she turn to see Ashford House illuminated by flames spreading from the laboratory fire she had started. And silhouetted against those flames, she saw Nathaniel standing perfectly still, watching her with what might have been respect or rage or something beyond either emotion. Elizabeth collapsed on the doorstep of Reverend Holmes's house, gasping for breath and clutching the notebook that represented her only proof. The minister answered her frantic pounding with a candle in hand, his face transforming from annoyance to horror as he took in her appearance. Torn clothing, blood on her hands from the broken window, and eyes wide with terror. "Get the sheriff," she managed to say, "and gather the town council. Ashford House is burning, and there are people imprisoned below it. Timothy Fletcher is alive, but there is another man, Jacob Walsh, who needs immediate help." Within an hour, half the town had assembled, drawn by the glow of fire on the hill and Elizabeth's fragmentary explanations. Sheriff Morrison, an agging man who had held his position more through longevity than competence, organized a group to investigate despite obvious reluctance. They found Ashford House engulfed in flames, the fire having spread from the laboratory through the wooden interior. But the stone foundations remained intact, and when men with axes broke through the locked front door, they discovered the stairs leading down to the cells Elizabeth had described. They brought out Timothy Fletcher, still unconscious but alive, and Jacob Walsh, barely clinging to consciousness, but able to confirm Elizabeth's account with broken whispers about torture and experimentation. Nathaniel Ashford was gone. Whether he had fled into the winter darkness or perished somewhere in the burning house, no one could immediately determine. His disappearance only added to the horror as people began to truly understand what Elizabeth had discovered. The notebook she had taken became the key evidence. Sheriff Morrison read portions aloud to the assembled crowd, his voice shaking with disgust. The entries described experiments conducted over months, systematic infliction of pain to measure tolerance, administration of drugs to study altered consciousness, deliberate creation of dependencies to ensure compliance. Nathaniel had documented everything with scientific precision, including his future plans to expand his research throughout the region. "There are others," Elizabeth said, when she had recovered enough to speak coherently. "The journals in his study detail experiments going back generations. His grandfather, his father, they all participated in this. Ashford Hollow was built on this evil." Martha Hayes stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered face set with grim determination. "My husband knew," she confirmed. "He worked for the old Ashford and saw terrible things. People who went to that house for treatment and were never seen again. Children who disappeared and were explained away as runaways or victims of accident. The whole family was poisoned by their twisted beliefs." The revelation split the town. Some, particularly those most indebted to Nathaniel, argued that Elizabeth had misunderstood, that the experiments were legitimate medical research, that Nathaniel had been helping people and deserved the benefit of doubt. But as more evidence emerged from the burning house, as more people examined the cells and read portions of the journals, denial became impossible. Elizabeth's mother, still dependent on Nathaniel's tonic, suffered severe withdrawal symptoms that required Elizabeth to seek help from a doctor in the neighboring town. The physician, after examining both the patient and a sample of the medicine, confirmed Elizabeth's suspicions. The tonic contained morphine and other substances designed to create dependency, ensuring continued control over patients. "Your mother will recover," the doctor assured Elizabeth, "but it will take weeks and considerable discomfort. This man was not treating illness, but creating it, ensuring his patients could never escape his influence." Similar discoveries proliferated throughout Ashford Hollow. Workers at the mill found evidence that Nathaniel had been conducting experiments there as well, testing the effects of various chemicals on unknowing employees. Parents discovered that the educational materials he had brought to the schoolhouse contained subtle psychological manipulation, designed to make children more accepting of authority and less likely to question disturbing situations. The The full scope of the Ashford family's activities emerged slowly, like a wound gradually revealing its depth. Records indicated that over 50 people had disappeared from Ashford Hollow over 3 generations, all explained as natural deaths, departures, or accidents. Most had been poor, transient, or otherwise vulnerable, individuals whose absence would not provoke extensive investigation. 3 days after the fire, searchers found a partially collapsed tunnel extending from the house's foundation into the woods beyond. It appeared to be an escape route, confirming that Nathaniel had fled rather than perished. Tracks in the snow led toward the main road before being obscured by wind and fresh snowfall, making pursuit impossible. Sheriff Morrison sent descriptions of Nathaniel to authorities in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and other major cities, warning of a dangerous fugitive skilled in medical arts and psychological manipulation. But privately, he admitted to Elizabeth that men like Nathaniel, educated and articulate and bearing no obvious marks of their crimes, could disappear easily into the anonymity of urban life. He had money hidden away, Morrison said grimly. We found evidence of accounts in multiple banks under various names. He could be anywhere by now, and unless he makes a mistake, we may never find him. Possibility that Nathaniel remained at large, potentially continuing his experiments elsewhere, haunted Elizabeth. But a more immediate concern was the fate of Ashford Hollow itself. With the truth exposed, with the source of its recent prosperity revealed as tainted, the town faced a crisis of identity and survival. Winter deepened as Ashford Hollow struggled with the revelation of evil that had nested within it for generations. The town council held emergency meetings to determine how to proceed. Some argued for complete disclosure, believing only transparency could cleanse the community. Others feared that publicizing the full extent of the Ashford family's crimes would destroy what remained of the town's reputation and economy. Elizabeth found herself at the center of these debates, the woman who had exposed the truth and now bore responsibility for its consequences. She testified before investigators from the state capitol, describing what she had witnessed in the underground cells and providing the notebook that documented Nathaniel's experiments. She also faced anger from those whose livelihoods had depended on Ashford money, who blamed her for destroying their fragile security. "You should have kept silent," one mill worker told her bitterly. "We were surviving. Now the mill will close, our debts will be called in, and we will have nothing. Was your pride worth that?" The question haunted Elizabeth, but Martha Hayes provided grim comfort. "Evil does not become acceptable simply because people profit from it," the old woman said firmly. "Those who built their lives on Ashford money built on grave. Better to rebuild on honest ground than prosper through wickedness." In January of 1890, a traveling marshal named Thomas Blackwell arrived in Ashford Hollow with news that transformed the investigation. A physician in Baltimore had reported suspicious activities by a new colleague named Dr. Nathan Ashfield, who had recently established a practice specializing in nervous disorders. The description matched Nathaniel Ashford perfectly. "He is proceeding with extreme caution this time," Blackwell explained to Sheriff Morrison and Elizabeth. "But certain patterns are already visible: selective acceptance of patients, particular interest in those without close family ties, and acquisition of property with private facilities. He is preparing to resume his work." The marshal proposed sending Elizabeth to Baltimore as a witness, prepared to identify Nathaniel if he was indeed their fugitive. But Elizabeth had a different suggestion, one that made Blackwell regard her with new respect. "He knows my face," she said, "but he also knows I have evidence against him. If word reached him that I am coming to Baltimore, he might flee again. Or," she paused, "he might see it as an opportunity to eliminate the primary witness against him." "You propose using yourself as bait," Blackwell said quietly. "I propose giving him a reason to stay where he is until you can gather enough evidence to arrest him. Let him know I am coming, let him prepare whatever trap he intends, and be ready to intervene when he acts." The plan was dangerous and unprecedented, but Blackwell agreed after Elizabeth demonstrated her determination. They arranged for a letter to be sent to Dr. Ashfield, ostensibly from a concerned party warning him that Miss Elizabeth Garrett of Pennsylvania would be arriving to make accusations against him. The letter suggested she carried evidence that could destroy his new practice, but was traveling alone, without official protection. Elizabeth made the journey to Baltimore in early February, accompanied secretly by Blackwell and 2 federal agents. They established themselves in a boarding house near the address where Dr. Ashfield maintained his practice, a respectable brownstone in a quiet neighborhood. Elizabeth sent a message requesting an appointment, citing nervous exhaustion and seeking treatment. The reply came within hours. Dr. Ashfield would be pleased to see Miss Garrett the following evening at 7 o'clock. The late hour and private setting confirmed their suspicions about his intentions. Elizabeth arrived at the appointed time, her heart hammering but her expression calm. A servant showed her to a consulting room furnished with appropriate medical equipment and comfortable chairs. After a brief wait, Dr. Nathan Ashfield entered, and Elizabeth was looking once again at Nathaniel Ashford. He had altered his appearance slightly, cutting his hair shorter and growing a neat beard, but his eyes remained unchanged, cold, focused, and utterly devoid of doubt. He smiled at her with something approaching genuine pleasure. "Miss Garrett, how persistent you are. Most people would have accepted their fortunate escape and moved on with their lives. But you have chosen instead to pursue me across state lines, carrying what I assume is my notebook and making wild accusations. Tell me, do you truly believe anyone will credit the claims of a small-town schoolteacher against a respected physician?" "I believe," Elizabeth said carefully, "that truth has a way of emerging regardless of who speaks it." "Truth," Nathaniel repeated, as though tasting the word. "How quaint. You and your kind speak of truth as though it were simple and absolute. But truth is complex, Miss Garrett. The truth is that human knowledge advances through sacrifice. The truth is that suffering, properly understood and documented, provides insights impossible to obtain through gentle means. My family understood this for 3 generations. We were pioneers in understanding human endurance." "You were murderers," Elizabeth said flatly. "We were scientists," he corrected. "The murder was incidental to the research. Most subjects would have died of poverty or disease regardless. We merely gave their deaths meaning and purpose. And I will continue that work here, more carefully than before, learning from past mistakes." He moved toward a cabinet, and Elizabeth tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, he removed a familiar dark bottle. "I have been expecting you since I received that warning letter. A crude trap, really, but I appreciate the opportunity it provides. You see, I have developed a new formula since leaving Ashford Hollow, one that works far more quickly. Within minutes of drinking this, you will become compliant and suggestible. The effects last for hours, during which you will answer my questions about what evidence you possess and who else knows about it. Then, tragically, you will suffer a fatal reaction to the treatment, overcome by the nervous exhaustion that brought you seeking help." "And if I refuse to drink?" Elizabeth asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then I will force it, naturally. The servant who admitted you is loyal and capable. He is standing directly outside the door, waiting for my signal. You cannot escape, Miss Garrett. Your determination has led you into a trap as surely as your students once walked into mine." It was at this moment that Marshal Blackwell and his agents entered through a door Elizabeth had not noticed, concealed within the room's paneling. They had been listening from an adjacent office, waiting for Nathaniel's confession before revealing themselves. "Dr. Nathan Ashfield, or should I say Nathaniel Ashford," Blackwell announced, "you are under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and a list of additional charges that grows daily. Whatever you intended for Miss Garrett ends now." The transformation in Nathaniel's expression was remarkable. The calm superiority vanished, replaced by something wild and cornered. He lunged not for the door or window, but for Elizabeth herself, seizing her with surprising strength and producing a scalpel from his pocket with deadly intent. "She was always the danger," he said, his voice no longer measured but edged with fury. "Everything was manageable until she refused to accept necessity. If she had simply remained passive like the others, none of this would have been necessary." What happened next occurred in seconds, but would remain vivid in Elizabeth's memory forever. Blackwell drew his revolver and fired, the shot deafening in the confined space. Nathaniel staggered, the scalpel falling from his hand, but he did not fall. He stood swaying, staring at Elizabeth with an expression of absolute incomprehension, as though he could not process that his carefully constructed plans had failed. "The research," he whispered, "3 generations of research, knowledge that could have transformed medicine, and you have destroyed it all because you could not accept the necessary cost of progress." He collapsed then, and federal agents rushed forward to secure him. The shoulder wound proved serious but not fatal. Nathaniel Ashford would live to stand trial for his Crimesford Hollow, but when it came, it brought a sense of renewal that the town desperately needed. The trial of Nathaniel Ashford in Baltimore had been extensively documented in newspapers throughout the region, exposing not only his crimes, but the decades of horror perpetrated by the Ashford family. The publicity brought shame to the town, but also a strange kind of relief. The secret that had poisoned the community for generations was finally exposed to daylight. Nathaniel was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to hang, though he would ultimately die in prison of infection before the execution could be carried out. His death brought no satisfaction to Elizabeth, only a grim sense of conclusion. The trial had revealed the full extent of his research. Over 100 victims documented across 3 generations, experiments that had contributed nothing of value to medical science despite the suffering they caused. Ashford House was demolished by order of the state, its stones scattered and its foundations filled with earth. The underground cells were collapsed and sealed, becoming merely a dark memory beneath peaceful ground. The property was donated to the town with the stipulation that it never be built upon, creating a small park that children now played in without knowing what horrors had once lurked below. Elizabeth's mother recovered slowly from her dependency on Nathaniel's tonics, regaining her health and her independence. The experience had aged her, but it had also given her a fierce determination to speak openly about manipulation and control, helping other victims recognize the signs of exploitation before it was too late. The town itself underwent a painful transformation. Several families left, unable to bear the association with the Ashford crimes. Others stayed and worked to rebuild their community on more honest foundations. The mill reopened under new ownership, operating modestly but fairly. The schoolhouse became a center for community education, with Elizabeth teaching not just reading and arithmetic, but encouraging students to question authority and recognize the difference between legitimate guidance and dangerous control. Martha Hayes became Elizabeth's closest ally and friend. The 2 women bonded by their shared recognition of evil and their determination to prevent its recurrence. Together, they established a small lending library, filling it with books that encouraged critical thinking and independent judgment. They invited traveling lecturers and teachers, expanding the intellectual horizons of a community that had been deliberately kept isolated and vulnerable. In the autumn of 1890, a young journalist named Rebecca Stone arrived to write an article about Ashford Hollow's recovery from the Ashford family's legacy. She spent several weeks in the town, interviewing survivors and examining records. Her resulting article, published in a prominent Philadelphia newspaper, portrayed Elizabeth not as a heroine, but as an ordinary person who had chosen to act when others remained passive, emphasizing that such choices were available to everyone who witnessed injustice. "The lesson of Ashford Hollow," Stone wrote, "is not that evil is rare or extraordinary, but that it flourishes when good people choose complicity over confrontation." Miss Garrett's courage lay not in any supernatural bravery, but in her refusal to accept what others had normalized. In this, she provides a model for communities everywhere that face the choice between comfortable silence and difficult truth. Elizabeth found the article embarrassing, but appreciated its core message. She had learned through painful experience that horror often wore respectable faces, spoke in educated voices, and hid behind institutions that demanded obedience and trust. The monsters were not always obvious, but sometimes came disguised as benefactors and healers and protectors. On a cold evening in late November, Elizabeth stood at the window of her cottage looking toward the hill where Ashford House had once loomed over the town. The space was dark now, empty and peaceful, but she knew that what had happened there would never be completely erased. Memory persisted even when structures were demolished and perpetrators brought to justice. Her mother came to stand beside her, following her gaze. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "All the upheaval, all the pain of exposure?" Elizabeth considered the question honestly. "No," she said finally. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that so many suffered before the truth emerged, but I do not regret the exposure itself. Evil that remains hidden continues to corrupt. Evil brought into light, at least, offers the possibility of healing." "You sound like a preacher," her mother said with gentle amusement. "Perhaps, or perhaps just like someone who learned that silence in the face of wickedness is itself a form of participation." They stood together in comfortable silence, two women who had survived darkness and emerged scarred but unbroken. Outside, snow began to fall, covering Ashford Hollow in white that would melt with spring, as it always did, revealing whatever lay beneath to the patient examination of sunlight. The story of the Ashford family became a cautionary tale told throughout the region. A reminder that respectability and education were no guarantee of virtue, and that communities bore responsibility for recognizing and confronting evil within their midst. Elizabeth Garrett lived a long life, continuing to teach and eventually training new teachers who carried her lessons about vigilance and moral courage into other communities. Years later, when she was an elderly woman, a young student asked her what she remembered most about that terrible winter when she had discovered the truth about Nathaniel Ashford. Elizabeth was silent for a long moment, remembering the fear, the cold cells beneath Ashford House, and the moment when she had chosen to act despite overwhelming odds. "I remember learning," she said finally, "that the greatest horror is not what monsters do but what ordinary people permit by their silence. And I remember that even when we are afraid, even when we are small and powerless in the face of authority, we always retain one essential freedom, the choice to speak truth rather than accept comfortable lies. That choice is everything. It is the difference between complicity and resistance, between darkness and the possibility of light." The student wrote down her words carefully, understanding instinctively that they contained something important. And in that moment of teaching and learning, the legacy of Ashford Hollow's darkest days transformed into something redemptive, a lesson passed forward to generations who would face their own choices between silence and speech, between acceptance and resistance, between the comfortable darkness of willful ignorance and the difficult illumination of acknowledged truth. The wind whispered through the empty spaces where evil had once flourished, but in the schoolhouse, in the homes, in the hearts of those who had learned to recognize and resist corruption, a different kind of presence lingered. The quiet strength of ordinary people who had chosen, despite everything, to demand something better than complicity with wickedness. And that, Elizabeth knew, was the only victory that mattered against the persistent darkness that would always seek new forms, new voices, and new communities vulnerable to its promises. The struggle was eternal, but so too was the possibility of resistance, carried forward by each generation that learned to recognize evil beneath its respectable disguises and chose, despite the cost, to name it for what it was.